China's Century of Humiliation, the Opium Wars. Gürdeniz. How did a powerful civilization dominated for centuries by Confucian philosophy suffered a heavy defeat against Britain, a small island state, during the Opium Wars? How did it experience a century-long period of humiliation? Why did China, which at the time had the world's largest economy, the most advanced bureaucracy, and the richest productive capacity, fail to carry out the Industrial Revolution? What lessons did China draw from that difficult period to the present day? China's imperial past. The China of the Ming Dynasty was one of the world's most advanced civilizations and economies in the early 15th century. Confucianism emphasized a merit-based bureaucracy, educated statesmen, social order, and central authority. Thanks to this understanding, China, as a state shaped by philosophy, established a strong administrative structure and a stable system of governance, unlike many states of the period. While Christian Europe was struggling with feudal wars and political fragmentation under the dogma of religion during the same period, the Ming Dynasty had a strong centralized state, an advanced bureaucracy, high productive capacity, and some of the world's largest cities. In terms of population, industrial production, urbanization, engineering, and trade volume, China was far ahead of the West in the 15th century. Its population was around 70 million, and it produced more than 25% of global output. In the same period, Britain's share was around 2%, while the Ottoman Empire's share was around 4%. Maritime China. Technology such as paper, printing, the compass, and gunpowder had been developed in China centuries earlier. China was especially far ahead in seafaring. It is worth recalling that China had a rich maritime tradition in the 16th century.
The Chinese produced a celestial atlas 500 years before Europe, watertight compartments in multi-masted sailing ships, and stern-post rudders 300 years before Europe, and the magnetic compass 100 years before Europe. While Chinese shipyards were building multi-decked ships capable of carrying thousands of sailors, Europeans were still trying to explore the limits of the Atlantic Ocean. When we think of geographic discoveries, the discoveries of the 15th century come to mind. This is in fact a Western-centered ideological concept. What is meant here is the Europeans' firsts, not humanity's firsts. These continents had already been discovered by other civilizations. The dominant and hegemonic West, relying on its later superiority, imposed its own firsts as if they were humanity's firsts, and it succeeded in doing so. For example, why did Portugal, which we know discovered India, fail to discover China? Because Westerners only discovered lands inhabited by peoples more primitive than themselves, or rather lands they could colonize. When Portuguese sailors reached China at the beginning of the 16th century, the Chinese Emperor Wang Yangmi, seeing them, said, "The barbarians have arrived." Faced with China's superior civilization, the Portuguese returned without being able to discover it. During this period, under the command of Admiral Zheng He, a Muslim mariner whose name the Chinese pronounce as Cheng Ho, a fleet of 60 ships and 27,000 soldiers conducted naval and gunboat diplomacy in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean for 28 years between 1405 and 1433. It was highly successful. Yet for reasons that seem meaningless, China did not continue this success in seafaring, and maritime power did not become an imperial tradition. Despite Zheng He's great success, the reasons why China withdrew from the seas and entered a process of eliminating its navy are still debated today.
Among the explanations given for this retreat from the sea are the following. The emperor's diviners blamed the navy for a series of disasters that befell him. China turned inward on the grounds that there was nothing new in potential colonies that Great China did not already possess. And the navy was eliminated because autonomous administrative units that Admiral Zheng He and power circles close to him might establish overseas could one day enter into a struggle for independence and power against the homeland. China's decline. At the beginning of the 18th century, despite stagnation in many fields, China was still one of the world's largest economic centers. Its population was larger than that of all the major European states. Its domestic market was broader, and its production of tea, silk, and porcelain was unrivaled on a global scale. But economic size and technological superiority were not the same thing. While China derived its wealth from centuries-old agricultural production, crafts, and trade networks, Europe, especially Britain, was undergoing a very different transformation through the Industrial Revolution. Steam engines, modern shipyards, iron and steel production, mass manufacturing, and new weapons technologies were radically changing the West's military and economic power. China, meanwhile, continued to preserve its traditional order, believing itself to be the center of the world, and failed to adequately grasp the changing balance of power. In 1820, China had about 37% of the world's population, 33% of the world economy, and roughly 30% of global manufacturing output. By contrast, although Britain was the country of the first industrial revolution, it accounted for only about 6% of the world economy. Yet Britain was far ahead, not in economic size, in technological and military power.
In the 18th century, during the Qing dynasty, China rapidly weakened during the very years in which Europe was experiencing modernization and breakthroughs following reform, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and the Industrial Revolutions. It became subject to the colonial pressures of European imperialists led by Britain and later of Japan. This decline did not occur solely because of the intervention of foreign powers. Europe had become very powerful through plunder, colonization, and the transition from mercantilism to capitalism and imperialism. In the end, China's manufacturing sector declined, it failed to produce technology, and it missed the industrial revolutions. Despite its thousands of years of state tradition, strong bureaucracy, and high culture, China was defeated by Britain, an island state that came from thousands of kilometers away. Moreover, the subject of this war was not territory, but opium. With the Opium Wars, China's period of humiliation began. This process pushed China even farther away from the seas, from which it was already disconnected. The background of the Opium Wars. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Chinese products such as tea, silk, and porcelain were in great demand in Europe. However, the Chinese administration showed limited interest in European goods, and trade was conducted largely in exchange for silver. This created a serious trade deficit, especially for Britain. The Opium Wars would emerge as the most striking result of this contradiction. To solve the problem, Britain began smuggling opium produced in India into China. The trade, initially limited, soon reached enormous proportions. While millions of Chinese became addicted to opium, the country's silver reserves began to melt away rapidly. State revenues weakened, corruption in the bureaucracy increased, and military discipline deteriorated.
The opium issue was no longer merely a health problem. It had become a crisis that directly threatened state security. Before the First Opium War in 1839, a small share of China's population was addicted to opium. According to historians' estimates, among a population of about 400 million, the number of regular opium users was between 4 and 12 million, or about 1 to 3% of the population, rising to around 5% in the highest estimates. But the problem was not so much the number of users as the destructive effect opium had on the state's economic and administrative structure. As silver flowed out of the country through imports, the money supply contracted, tax collection became more difficult, the tax burden on peasants increased, and Qing finances were seriously shaken. During the same period, opium use spread among officials, soldiers, merchants, and craftsmen, reducing labor productivity, and as smuggling expanded, bribery and corruption among port officials, customs officers, and local administrators grew rapidly. The First and Second Opium Wars. The Qing dynasty banned the opium trade in order to stop its destructive effects. In 1839, the emperor's special commissioner Lin Zexu seized and destroyed a large quantity of opium belonging to British merchants in Canton. The London government regarded this event as an intervention against free trade and decided to use military force. The resulting conflict was not only about the opium trade, it was about the imbalance of power between the West, which had completed the Industrial Revolution and become a global naval power, and China, which was trying to preserve its traditional order. The Qing Empire was caught unprepared against British military power, supported by steam-powered warships, modern artillery systems, and industrial production. Thus, the tragedy that would drag China into the century of humiliation began exactly 1 year after the 1838 Treaty of Balta-Liman, which reduced the Ottoman Empire to a semi-colonial position under Britain, was signed. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the collapse of China contain major similarities. In the First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, the Royal Navy quickly broke China's coastal defenses and captured important ports, advancing up the Yangtze River as far as Nanjing. With the Treaty of Nanjing, signed at the end of the war in 1842, Hong Kong was ceded to Britain. 5 ports were opened to foreign trade. China agreed to pay heavy indemnities, and the era of unequal treaties began. Yet even this treaty did not satisfy Britain, the representative of shameless imperialism, or the other Western states. About 14 years later, the Second Opium War broke out in 1856. Its aim was no longer merely to protect the opium trade, but to open China completely to foreign trade, to give foreign states the right to establish permanent legations in Beijing, to allow missionary activity, and to provide Western merchants with far broader economic and legal privileges. Thanks to the Royal Navy's overwhelming superiority, and this time the military support of France, which joined Britain, the Allied forces captured Tianjin and then Beijing, forcing the Qing dynasty to make much heavier concessions. After 4 years, the war ended in a severe military and political defeat for the empire. British and French forces advanced as far as Beijing and occupied the capital. The emperor was forced to flee the city, and the old summer palace, a symbol of China's grandeur, was looted and burned. With the Convention of Peking signed at the end of the war, China opened more ports to foreign trade, accepted the permanent presence of foreign legations in Beijing, granted broad privileges to Christian missionaries and foreign merchants, agreed to pay heavy war indemnities, and the opium trade was effectively legalized. This defeat seriously weakened the sovereignty of the Qing state and went down in history as one of the most traumatic turning points of China's century of humiliation. Philosophy, religion, and becoming maritime. The Opium Wars were not merely a military defeat. At a deeper level, they were the result of a civilization's inability to adapt to changing world conditions. For this reason, historians and Chinese thinkers have long debated the same question. Why could the morality of Confucius, the wisdom of Buddha, and China's millennia-old state tradition not protect China against the rise of the West? Beyond that, why could neither Confucian nor Buddhist teachings prevent 12 million people in China from using drugs? The answer to these questions should be sought not only in comparisons of military power, but also in China's political culture, education system, approach to technology, and way of perceiving the world. This is the center of gravity of the Opium Wars. For China's defeat up to 1949, when Mao's communist revolution secured national unity and protected China's borders, revealed not the crisis of an army, but the crisis of a model of civilization. Confucianism was essentially a philosophy of state and society, centered on family, moral discipline, hierarchy, and loyalty to the state. Confucius's basic question was, how can society be kept in order? But the problem revealed by the Opium Wars was different. The issue was no longer how society should be governed, but how imperial powers that had experienced the Industrial Revolution could be stopped.
Confucian bureaucracy could diagnose moral decay, but it could not respond to steamships, modern cannons, and industrial production. In other words, Confucianism could govern the state, but it could not transform the state in the industrial age. China's problem was not a lack of morality. It was that China was facing rivals with technological superiority. On the other hand, Buddhism was also highly influential in China during the same period. Buddhism sought an answer to a very different question. Buddha's focus was not the state, but the human being, not society, but the individual, not war, but suffering. Buddha's thought advised people to free themselves from desire, attain inner peace, and transcend worldly attachments. It was not equally functional in producing state-building, industrial policy, or military strategy. When British warships reached China's shores, Buddhist monasteries could not build a modern navy. There was no direct link between the search for nirvana and the Industrial Revolution. Therefore, Buddhism could give spiritual strength to Chinese society, but it could not produce a technological solution against imperialist assault. Likewise, Buddhism could not prevent drug addiction. But the fight against drugs was a problem not only for China, but for the whole world then, just as it is today. For this reason, the opium crisis cannot be explained solely as a failure of Buddhism or Confucianism. History shows that addictive substances such as drugs cannot be prevented merely by the moral teachings of a religion or philosophy. Buddhist, Confucian, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, and secular societies have all encountered similar problems in different periods. Indeed, throughout history, states and great powers have used drugs not only for economic gain, but also as a geopolitical instrument to weaken rival societies. The Opium Wars are one of the most striking examples of this.
Therefore, lasting success in the fight against drugs is possible not only through moral advice, but through strong state control, an effective legal system, quality education, a sound family structure, social values, and conscious public policy. Otherwise, even the oldest religions and strongest philosophical traditions are not sufficient on their own against economic interests and organized crime networks. Preserving order or changing. For 544 years, the Ming and Qing Chinese dynasties adopted Confucianism's bureaucratic understanding, which prioritized stability as their state philosophy, while in social culture they embraced Buddhism's approach of limiting worldly ambitions. This mentality valued preserving order more than creating revolution and change. By contrast, Protestant Europe, especially Britain and the Netherlands, developed a cultural climate that morally legitimized trade, individual enterprise, profit, overseas expansion, and technological innovation. The essential difference here was seafaring. At the beginning of the 15th century, Admiral Zheng He's war fleet was technically superior to those of the Europeans, but the Ming court did not see seafaring as one of the state's fundamental fields of existence. China's wealth was already inside the country. Thanks to its fertile agricultural basins, vast population, and huge domestic market, it did not have a vital dependence on foreign trade. Seafaring was seen not as a necessity but as a choice. For Britain and the Netherlands, the situation was exactly the opposite. Small populations, limited agricultural land, and island geography compelled them towards trade in the sea. Protestant ethics also supported this. As the German sociologist Max Weber pointed out, in Protestant culture, work, saving, capital accumulation, and worldly success became moral values and conditions of the path to heaven. This translated directly into shipbuilding, insurance, banking, overseas trade, and industrial investment.
While China continued to train successful bureaucrats during the same period, Europe was training successful ship owners, merchants, and engineers, and bringing to life the military power that would protect and support them. China had not morally collapsed, but it had failed to read the world's changing balance of power quickly enough. Thanks to Protestant ethics, which questioned Christian dogma in the most radical way, Britain had leapt much farther ahead than Catholics and Orthodox Christians. It had removed all obstacles before reason and science. It had been able to go beyond the horizon through seafaring, and it had experienced the Industrial Revolution. On a tiny island, it was producing steel, steamships, and heavy naval guns. It had a modern financial system, and thanks to its powerful navy, it controlled the global maritime trade network and the choke points of maritime commerce. The combination of Protestant ethics and seafaring created the largest and most powerful imperialist state the world had seen in those years. Through the East India and Levant companies, the British enabled private entrepreneurs to trade with state support. By founding the Royal Society in 1675, they placed science and reason alongside Protestant faith against religious dogma and conservatism. The founder of the Royal Society, Bacon, was a scientist and statesman who understood the importance of the seas very well. He said the following about command of the seas: "But this much is certain, that he that commands the sea is at great liberty, and may take as much and as little of the war as he will." Thus, by integrating Protestant ethics with trade and naval power, Britain grew continuously at sea. The similarity between the Ottoman Empire and China. When the last 2 centuries of the Ottoman Empire and the Chinese Empire are examined, geopolitical ruptures that resemble each other to a surprising degree can be seen.
Both states existed for about 5 to 6 centuries as the strongest political organizations of their continents, but after missing the Industrial Revolution, they faced pressure from Western states that used sea power on a global scale. For China, this process began with the First Opium War of 1839–1842 and the Second Opium War of 1856–1860. The firepower of the British Navy forcibly opened China's doors, and the Qing dynasty was forced to make heavy concessions. Then, after the Boxer Rebellion of 1900, the 8-nation alliance consisting of Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, the United States, Austria-Hungary, and Italy entered Beijing and effectively placed China's political will under pressure. The Ottoman state experienced a similar fate. With the 1838 Treaty of Balta-Liman, it largely lost its economic independence vis-à-vis Britain. In 1807, the British fleet under Admiral Duckworth came as far as the approaches to Istanbul and directly threatened the administration of Selim III. In 1878, the British Navy entered the Bosphorus to stop Russia and obtained the administration of Cyprus in return. In 1881, with the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, Ottoman finances were placed under the control of European creditors, and in 1882, Egypt was occupied by Britain. Later, with the Reval meeting of 1908, Britain and Russia discussed the future of Ottoman geography between themselves, while the 1915 Gallipoli campaign became the largest joint invasion attempt by Western sea powers to capture the Ottoman capital. As a continuation of this process, the occupation of Izmir on May 15, 1919, represented the final major move aimed at partitioning Anatolia. The historical lifespans of the empires are also strikingly close to each other. In China, the Ming dynasty, 1368 to 1644, and then the Qing dynasty, 1644 to 1912, formed an uninterrupted imperial tradition of roughly 5.5 centuries, while the Ottoman state ruled for about 6 centuries between 1299 and 1922.
Both states were first weakened by foreign interventions and then underwent major internal political transformations. The 1911 revolution in China can be seen as a transitional phase similar to the 1908 Second Constitutional Era and the Committee of Union and Progress period in the Ottoman Empire. However, the true founding of modern states took place under the leadership of Sun Yat-sen in 1911 and Mao Zedong in 1949 in China, and under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk after the 1919–1923 national struggle in Turkey. All three leaders transformed states that had been occupied, fragmented, and vulnerable to foreign intervention into independent and sovereign nation-states once again. However, after 1949 China and after 1952 Turkey followed different strategic paths. While opening up to the outside world, China placed great importance on preserving state sovereignty, its national industry, and its geopolitical priorities, and sought to integrate into the global system on its own terms. Turkey, meanwhile, became an integral part of the Western security architecture through NATO membership, and different assessments have been made about the strategic consequences of this. In this respect, the shared history of the Ottoman Empire and China is not only a history of imperial interventions, it is also the shared memory of two great civilizations regarding how sovereignty was lost and how it was regained. The main lesson is that independence can be protected not only through military victories, but by building sustainable national power in the economic, technological, maritime, and geopolitical fields. History indicates that China has followed a long-term and state-centered strategy in this regard, and that Turkey, based on its own historical experience, must develop a policy of balance that continuously strengthens its strategic autonomy.
The lessons China drew today. In many of his speeches, Chinese President Xi Jinping does not attribute China's decline entirely to the imperialist powers exemplified by the Opium Wars. On the contrary, he points to mistakes in China's own history as one of the important reasons for China's weakening. In particular, he criticizes internal factors such as the closed-door policy seen in the late Ming period and later in the Qing period, China's failure to catch the scientific and industrial revolutions in time, and its isolation from the world. Xi uses this approach as one of the justifications for China's opening to the outside world and technological development today. On the other hand, the official narrative of the Chinese Communist Party includes both internal and external factors. It criticizes Western imperialist powers and later Japan for exploiting China's internal weaknesses and imposing unequal treaties. To understand China's behavior today, it is necessary to understand the psychological trace left by the Opium Wars. The Chinese see this period not as a drug problem, but as a problem of insufficient national power. Behind many strategic decisions taken in Beijing today, the shadow of the Opium Wars still remains. China is trying to create a country whose gates no foreign power can ever again force open with opium ships. For this reason, national unity, economic independence, technological superiority, industrial capacity, scientific research, and sea power are among modern China's core priorities. A significant part of the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy lies precisely here. The party presents itself as the structure that ended the period of humiliation that began with the Opium Wars and raised China once again to the status of a great power. Ideology has been added alongside philosophy. Yet even though this ideology is communist in theory, in practice it has undergone a transformation through state capitalism. In this respect, China is ideologically a Marxist-Leninist state, but in terms of governing culture, it is largely Confucian, and in terms of its economic system, it applies a hybrid model that combines state capitalism with market mechanisms. The lessons Turkey should draw. The Opium Wars and China's century of humiliation are in fact not only China's story, but also the story of the Ottoman Empire, which shared a similar fate in the same period. Both empires had been great powers for centuries, but they failed to read the changing world in time and were late in grasping the Industrial Revolution, the scientific transformation, and the decisive role of sea power. As a result, they were forced to retreat in the face of the West's technological and maritime superiority. There are striking similarities between the attitude of the Chinese dynasties and the Mandarin bureaucracy, and the state approach of the House of Osman, the Enderan, and the central bureaucracy. Both systems trained the world's most successful state cadres during their founding and rising periods, and created a strong ruling class based on merit. Over time, however, both structures turned from institutions that managed change into institutions that preserved the existing order. In China, the examination system, based on memorizing the Confucian classics, trained bureaucrats more than engineers and inventors. In the Ottoman Empire, the Enderan and the religious learned establishment prioritized military and administrative ability, while the conservative structure of religion, in the dialectic of reason versus transmitted authority, chose transmitted authority and pushed industry, engineering, and scientific research into the background. From the 17th and 18th centuries onward,
Bribery, favoritism, the sale of offices, and personal interest networks eroded state capacity in both states. In the Ottoman Empire, the devshirme system had been a powerful mechanism that produced merit in the early periods. But in later centuries, the deterioration of the system, palace factions, and the strengthening of interest groups weakened central authority. In China, the Mandarin bureaucracy resisted reforms, while in the Ottoman Empire, bureaucratic and military elites treated many modernization initiatives with caution. In the end, while the teachings of Confucianism and Buddhism prevailed in one empire and Islam in the other, both empires failed to adapt in time to the great transformation taking place in science, technology, industry, and seafaring. For this reason, the West's superiority resulted not only from stronger armies, but also from state institutions that learned faster, produced innovation, and adapted to change, and from the decision-makers and practitioners trained by those institutions. Our commander-in-chief and eternal leader, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, drew important lessons from historical collapses and built the Republic not merely as a new state, but also as a project of civilizational transformation. The 6 arrows that form the foundation of the Republic are not only a political program, but a comprehensive development model aimed at preventing the collapse of great states. Statism aimed to create national capabilities in industrialization and strategic sectors. Populism aimed to create an educated and productive society. Secularism aimed to remove dogmatic obstacles before reason and science, and revolutionism aimed at continuous renewal that would adapt to a changing world. Republicanism and nationalism created the nation-state and belonging to a higher identity. The fact that China and the Ottoman Empire declined in almost the same periods shows the same truth. In the climate created by the French Revolution, during the period in which the First and Second Industrial Revolutions occurred, trying to preserve order could not replace change. When the balance of power in the world changes, states that stand still fall behind, even if they possess the deepest-rooted civilizations. For this reason, the greatest legacy of the Republic is making reason and science the fundamental guide of state administration. Indeed, Ataturk's statement, "The truest guide in life is science," is a geopolitical development strategy. The lesson that must be drawn in the global competitive environment Turkey faces today is the same. A strong state, a strong economy, advanced technology, quality education, scientific production, industrialization, and seafaring cannot be considered separately from one another. History shows that religions and philosophies can offer societies a moral framework. However, the decisive elements of becoming a great power are reason, science, technology, production, law, education, and state capacity. The founding philosophy of the Republic was built precisely on this truth. Turkey's future depends on sustaining Ataturk's goal of contemporary civilization through a development approach based on science and reason, constantly renewing itself and opening to the seas.